Everyone, and welcome to the third mini lesson out of the government curriculum. Today we're going to be looking at the structure of various governments. In the previous mini lesson, you learned about the purpose of government and why governments exist, and basically some of the original philosophies behind government. And then in the previous one, you learned about the different types of government that exist. Today we're going to look at the different structures those governments can fall into. The learning target for this lesson is I can compare and contrast federal, confederal, and unitary systems of government. So in this mini lesson, we're going to focus on basically how the power is balanced within these different types of government, as well as examples of each. The first type we're going to focus on is considered federal. Federal is kind of a misnomer in terms of what it actually means. If you hear the term federal, you probably think that this form of government has a strong federal government. However, a federal government has a power shared between a powerful federal government and states or provinces. So within a country that has a federal government, there's a balance of power between the federal government, which is usually the overall government of the country, as well as the individual governments. So within some countries, those individual governments would be considered state governments, and in some countries, those would be considered provinces. In either case, it gives local governments more power than they otherwise would have, because typically there's some sort of law document that is outlining the distribution of power between the federal and the state governments or the province governments, which indicates which responsibilities different levels of government have. There are a lot of examples of federal governments. In fact, they are the most popular out there. But this is what the United States has. So, for example, there are certain responsibilities that the federal government, whether that be the president or the Congress or the Supreme Court, are responsible for in Washington, D.C. There are certain responsibilities that the state governments have. So, in Michigan, those state governments are carried out in Lansing. And then there are certain responsibilities that fall to the local level. So, for example, in the United States, it is the responsibility of individual states to run the schools. It is the responsibility of the federal government to determine if there are going to be any changes made to the Constitution. It is states' responsibilities to run elections. It's federal government's responsibility to deem if laws that individual states are making are constitutional or not, and so on. So later on in the year, we're going to look at the structure within the United States in greater detail. However, there are several other examples that exist, including Germany, Australia, and Canada. The next system is a unitary government. By definition, a unitary government is when a central government controls weak states. The power is not shared between states and countries or provinces. Instead, there is a very strong central government, and that central government creates uniform policies for all parts of the country. So no matter what part of the country you live in, or what state you live in, or what province you live in, you're going to have to follow the laws of the federal government. Typically speaking, in a unitary government, if there are any state or local governments, they have very limited powers. So because they are unitary, meaning that everyone's following the same laws and rules and restrictions, it doesn't consider local differences. So this may sound good, or this may sound easy, where an entire country is running under the same laws, and in some cases that can be a good thing. However, especially if you're looking at more complex systems, what happens is the federal government's not considering everyone's needs in every location within that country, and consequently things kind of fall through the cracks. Examples of unitary systems that exist today include China, France, and Japan. The final system that we're going to look at is considered a confederate. Confederate is when there is a weak or loose organization of states which agree to follow the central government. In a Confederate government, there is no significant uniform policies. In other words, the federal government either doesn't really have uniform policies, or people can choose whether they do or do not want to follow them, or states can choose whether they do or do not want to follow them. Consequently, this gives the local governments almost complete control. There have been a lot of examples of attempted confederates throughout history, dating all the way back to the creation of the United States. Initially, when the United States were created under the Articles of Confederation, Constitution, it created the United States of America, basically created a confederacy between the different states where the states had a majority of the power to create legislation and choose whether they were following taxes and things like that. And there was very limited power at the federal level. A more significant example from history, because it lasted longer, was under the Civil War. The Confederate States, which made up the southern states of the United States, formed a confederacy, hence the term Confederate, where the states were given a majority of the power. They weren't forced to follow the federal government and things like that. Modern day examples include Belgium and Switzerland. So there are various types of government that exist, but there are also different types of systems of government, and they look a little different depending on the conditions in individual countries. For a majority of the curriculum for government, we're going to focus on the systems within the United States. So you'll hear a lot more about the federal system. However, it's important to acknowledge that this does not exist in every country and that these other systems have in some way impacted the United States history as well.